Hello, shalom, and greetings, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ. Let us dive into the Word. Now, in today's first reading, taken from the first epistle of Peter, St. Peter the Apostle speaks with striking truth. He says, "Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Now, that is not merely a poetic language, it actually describes something more interior. And if we reflect into the life of the apostles, that is precisely where Mark's story begins. My dear brothers and sisters in Christ, today we celebrate the feast of St. Mark the Evangelist. You see, Mark is not introduced to us as a heroic figure. In the Acts of the Apostles, he sets out on a mission and then he returns back and he leaves. Now, whatever the reason, the result is that Paul the Apostle later refuses to take him again. Now, it is here that Peter's roaring lion becomes more than an image. Because what does the enemy do in such moments? He accuses, he discourages, and he whispers that the story is over. And Mark could very well have disappeared at that point, forgotten and defined by that one decision that he took. But then something happens. Mark comes under the care of Peter. And Peter, of all people, knows what it is to fail and to be restored. He knows what it is to stand near Christ and then to deny him. So when Peter calls Mark, in the first reading, when he calls Mark, my son, this is not a sentimental language. It is the language of formation, of patient accompaniment, and of grace working overtime. And under that guidance, Mark is changed steadily, until the one who once withdrew becomes the one who proclaims. You see, the one who once faltered becomes the one who writes the Gospel of Mark, the very Gospel that carries the command, go into all the world and proclaim the Gospel to every creature. Now, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ, here is where something quite profound is seen. You see, Peter warns of a lion that roars to devour. Like a force that seeks to scatter and silence. And yet, in the tradition of the church, Mark himself is remembered as a lion, as a winged lion. So, what has happened? It is not that the image has been confused, it actually has been redeemed. You see, the roar that once symbolized fear becomes in Mark a symbol of proclamation. The enemy roars to paralyze, but through Mark, the gospel begins to roar with truth. Now, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ, this is what grace does. It does not merely repairs the grace of God, it transforms. It takes what was once a place of weakness and turns it into a place of witness. And this is not simply about Mark, because the same pattern repeats itself in the Christian life. You see, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ, each of us at some point face that moment of crisis. That moment where we step back, we hesitate or fall short. And in that space, the roaring lion is not abstract. It is experienced in doubt, in shame, in the temptation to give up. But the gospel does not end there. You see, when God steps in, when grace is allowed to work, something shifts. And it's not always visible and it's not always, quick or fast, but it's always true. When a person begins to change and transforms in Christ, fear gives way to courage, silence gives way to witness, and uncertainty gives way to clarity. Now, you see, tradition tells us that Mark eventually carried this gospel to Alexandria, a place filled with competing ideas and restless searching, where a lot of learned and academics are there. In other words, something like our modern world, and he does not go as someone untouched by struggle. He goes precisely as someone who has been through it and has been transformed. So, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ, perhaps the question today is not whether we have faced the roaring lion. The question is, will that voice define us? Or will the gospel find its voice through us? Because in the end, Mark is remembered not for his failure, but for what God did with it. From a moment of crisis to a life of mission and to a symbol that still speaks today. Not the lion that devours, but the lion that proclaims Christ. So let us reflect today, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ. What do we do with this grace of God? Do we allow it in our lives? Do we allow it to transform us from all the noises of this roaring lion that seeks to confuse us and destroy us? Now, do we allow the grace of God to come in and transform us so that we may be able to proclaim Christ boldly? So as we celebrate the feast of Saint Mark the Evangelist today, let us ask the intercession of Saint Mark, so that we will be more brave and we'll be more open for the grace of God to work in our lives. Have a nice day. Thank you and God bless.